If Taylor Swift started attending my church, I have no idea what we would do with her. I see zero skill sets that would be useful for what we're doing and advancing the kingdom of God in our community. I'm only being a little cheeky here, but I'm not joking. Here's where it gets crazy. When you're talking about being excellent, a good question to ask yourself is, what can I do that no one else can? So what does your church do in your community that no other organization can do? How are you located to serve somebody and serve a need that nobody else even knows exists? That's when it gets fun.
Welcome to the Be Unbound podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Brush, along with our producer and co-host, David Rethemeyer. Welcome, David. We just finished having a discussion with Nathan Rittenhouse, who is a longtime friend of Unbound and both of us personally. He's spoken at Unbound events, teaches a class for our second-year Unbound students. Also, we're about to release an online class that he and his co-host from his ministry and podcast, Thinking Out Loud, we're about to release a class that the two of them taught that we're excited about that will be coming up shortly. So keep your eyes open for that. And as usual, David, when we're done talking with Nathan, I think I told him, I have notes on like 8 things that we could have made entire podcast episodes out of. Nathan is somebody who almost every time he opens his mouth, I'm like, that's a better way to look at things. He also is a master of the analogy. He threw 3 or 4 of them out during this conversation, which honestly was not his strongest showing. Not that they were bad analogies, but I've known Nathan to have, 3 analogies in one sentence sometimes, all of which were precisely calibrated to absolutely illustrate what he was talking about. So anyhow, it was a fun conversation. And David, I don't know if there's anything that jumped out at you before we introduce this to the audience.
I think I would just say to anybody who's curious about what you're going to be in for, Nathan is somebody who I always appreciate listening to, especially in his podcasts, because he is someone who is able to think through things and explain ideas thoroughly and intelligently without sounding overly wordy or academic. He very much is somebody who looks to think through things well and deeply, but at a practical level. And so I think that is pretty much about as high as a compliment that I can give for anybody who is talking for 45 minutes.
I agree with that. So we hope you enjoy this conversation we had with Nathan Rittenhouse. Well, we get to welcome Nathan Rittenhouse to the podcast today. I've got a pretty cool introduction here. So Nathan, I'm just going to subject you to this. So I met Nathan when we were both at Bridgewater College. I was the director of missions. I was coming in early to work out in the gym. There was a young man who was working the desk at the Funkhauser Health and Wellness Center, and he was reading his Bible early in the morning. And I thought, well, there's an interesting combination. He's up early, he's paying attention and doing his job, and he also is doing devotions at the same time. So I should get to know him. Found out we had some previous family connections of various kinds. And then a couple of years later, I told the vice president, I said, we should make an offer to Nathan and hire him as a missions counselor, because if we don't, he'll figure out that he can make more money someplace else. And so we did, and he said yes. And so we worked together for a little bit. Then I left to start a journey that eventually wound up in Unbound. Nathan did a whole bunch of things, including some significant apologetics work, some kind of direct-to-consumer farming that continues to go on. And now Nathan is founder and partner in Thinking Out Loud Ministries, which is a podcast ministry as well as a speaking ministry. Full disclosure, I get the privilege of being on the board of Thinking Out Loud, so I think Nathan's cool in 2 different ways. But along the way, we've had a lot of church connections. Nathan preaches at my congregation occasionally. We're in the same denomination and have gone through some interesting times there. And Nathan has a very unique community that he lives in West Virginia, and just has a really fascinating perspective of life. So I've learned something every time I've talked to Nathan since he was a college student working at the Funkhauser Center, and that has only increased as the years has gone by. And it is an honor and a delight to have him on the podcast here. So Nathan, welcome to the Be Unbound podcast.
Well, thank you so much. Great to be here and with you. And it's always amusing to me to see what we end up talking about. So can't wait.
There's other people that are generally amused by what we end up talking about too. And so we've had some interesting conversations. I'm sure this one will be one as well. I took the liberty of putting a few slight guide rails on a piece of paper, which we'll probably abandon shortly. David actually can see that piece of paper, so he's going to be laughing as we probably continue on with this.
I'm highly looking forward to this.
Nathan has also been a speaker at several of our events for Unbound, and we're in the process of getting ready to release a course that features Nathan and his partner, Cameron McAllister, that will soon be available to folks and see it through Unbound, and so we're excited about that as well. Nathan, I wanted to kick off with something that you and I have talked about in various places in various ways, and it's kind of been a burr underneath my saddle recently. But one of the things that I think I see more and more is that I see people kind of yanking the brake and saying, now, wait a second, the world's going a little crazy here, and I don't really like what I'm seeing. And I just have some deep questions about what exactly I'm supposed to be doing here. And that often takes the form of people saying, I thought I was supposed to be successful, and I'm now having, and that was just kind of the assumed sort of course of action. And I'm now having second thoughts about that. And we see this particularly in what I consider to be sort of the traditional educational process, which is that people go to school and graduate from high school, and people in high school say you should go to college, and colleges say, come to us and we'll make you successful, which is really code for let us give you the skills that will make you rich, famous, and powerful, or one of those or all three. And then what happens is people find out it's actually quite difficult to become rich, famous, or powerful, and they start to become cynical. They often become bitter after that, and that bitterness often fades to kind of despair. And that runs right in the face of almost everything that we're taught from a Christian aspect. But I think it also just runs right in the face in terms of practical experience and the way that life actually works and what makes people feel fulfilled and satisfied. So I just wanted to kind of start there because I think Christianity's done this interesting thing too, where a lot of people in the church say the same thing. If you want to fix the culture, you can do it by becoming rich, famous, and powerful. And as long as I've known you, you've had a very different take on that and a different perspective. And in fact, you teach that in a class that you offer to our second year Unbound students and often generates a lot of conversation. So maybe take a little moment and sort of reflect on that a little bit. And I know the students are in that second year class are often coming out of the first couple of classes, scratching their head a little bit and going, all right, this is totally challenging the way I'm thinking, which is some of the things I like to bring in here. So.
Well, let's begin that with reminding everyone listening that you started off by saying, hey, you can come work for me and make less money. And I agreed to that. So that should have been the first point in this conversation where, something else is going on. So you used an interesting, let me just play with this idea for a second and see if you think this is true. You used rich, famous, powerful, I think, as kind of the ideal of what we're seeking. And I wonder if there isn't a level kind of subconsciously below that, or perhaps not subconsciously, where what fundamentally we seek as humans and then have specialized in as Americans is security and comfort. And that the rich, famous, powerful paradigm is a way of pursuing economic security and pleasure, comfort. We don't have to be afraid. We don't need to worry. We have the well-padded 401k retirement plan. We have the right house, the right social groups, and, have an interesting profile on our social media platforms. So there's a sense in which there is a self-idolization that happens there. But a lot of times I think the other things that we're focusing on are actually attempts to grant us security and comfort across multiple kind of venues and avenues of life. The challenge you run into there is twofold. One, thinking of that as a Christian, is that those categories don't play well as a Christian. And B, we're just not good at them, even if we run them to what we're promised culturally speaking. So massive things happen from COVID to Israel, Hamas, whatever, throw it in there. Then you throw in some heart attacks and some car wrecks and some divorces and, somehow brokenness gets inside our best systems for comfort and security. And all of a sudden we're left feeling like we just spent a lot of time and money and a lot of effort in pursuing something that was a promise to us that ultimately ends up letting us down. So I didn't really answer your question other than to say, I think that's an extra level of exhaustion. And maybe, so exhaustion would be one word of how I would see some people. And I would also see hopelessness masquerading as apathy as another paradigm for thinking about what people are feeling right now. If you don't think that your life can actually change and that you don't think you're the one who can actually change it and you don't think there's a God who can change it, that's hopelessness, but it'll appear to be apathy, just kind of in the way that we handle it. So those are some complicating factors that I see at play that go along with what you were saying there.
Yeah, picking up that theme, I wonder, and this is kind of a rough historical timeline, but so I think about, so you have a post-war, meaning World War II, a post-war sort of optimism that then fades into some of the bitterness of the 60s and 70s, but then is replaced by a rampant materialism that reaches its kind. And I think that that's true, what you said, in the sense that, coming out of the 80s, the materialistic 80s, into the 90s, where honestly, there are people arguing that we were at the end of history, that major wars were not going to be a thing anymore, that we'd kind of arrived at peace. And then you come out of the 90s into the 2000s with a lot of technology explosions that just makes a lot of things possible. And I think that that is correct in the sense that people go, yeah, I'm looking for that comfort. I'm looking for that security. And so rich fame, and I don't know about fame and power, but certainly fortune is the way to do that. And from an American perspective, that looks obtainable. Then you face a great recession. Most recent iteration would be COVID, but the terrorism of the early 2000s with 9/11 and all those kinds of things. And you have people that say, wait a second, there's something more. And here's where I think things get a little more subtle, but maybe a little bit more important, which is I think you're right in that people say, yep, I think this is the way. I'm looking for security and comfort and all those kinds of things. And yet you look at the millennials and Gen Z and you see them coming up and saying, no, there's got to be more than that. I'm called to make a difference. There's problems in this world. Like there's terrorism and there's recessions and there's all these kinds of issues. And so I need to make a difference in the world. But then they double down on the same idea. And so now, and I think I notice this most in terms of even inside the church, where we would say, hey, you have a responsibility to change the world. You have a real calling to go forward and make this better, to build the kingdom. So far, so good. But then the church in North America, at least, and the United States is, of course, my greatest familiarity, and so I'm speaking from as a native there, would say things like, and by the way, just so you know, the way to do that is become rich, famous, or powerful. If you have a lot of money, you can give it to a lot of great ministry causes. If you're powerful, you can get the right political things in place. And if you're famous, you can use your fame as a platform for Jesus, and you can change these things. And so you end up having this situation where there's a doubling down on that desire for comfort and security, where people say, yep, we don't have as much comfort and security as we think, but there's a desire to change the world. And yet the tools that we're using, and I find this like it's subtle and not so subtle. I mean, I've seen the church basically telling students this accidentally, but I've been in some places where the church tells students this explicitly. Like the people that we put on stage are the people that, got really famous drilling thousands of wells in Africa. You go forward and do the same. There's nothing wrong with the person that got an early start and is a young person digging thousands of wells in Africa. They're just a real anomaly. And so there's a what I call a chasing of anomalies here, where all of a sudden the anomaly is held as the standard, but the reality is it's an anomaly. And so you have people that go, I want to be that. Oh, look, it's hard to be that. I think what they told me to be that, they were just giving me a bunch of lies. Now I'm frustrated because I've been lied to. Now I'm in despair because I can't do anything. Does that hold true with some of your experience, or does that make sense?
Yeah, well, let me throw this in there. So one of our children is named Thaddeus. As a disciple, what did Thaddeus do in the New Testament? We don't know. Like he's just mentioned in a list somewhere. And so my wife and I, and so maybe this will set up some of my thinking on this. My wife and I said, let's name our son after someone who was a disciple of Jesus, and that was enough. So we don't have a record of Thaddeus planting churches anywhere. We don't have a record of Thaddeus being martyred anywhere. We don't have a record of Thaddeus doing any miracles. We don't have a record, it's just not there. But does it need to be in order for him to be a significant member of the 12 disciples and apostles of Jesus? And I'm sure he did change the world, but it's not recorded anywhere. And so that fits into, I think, some of the background thinking I'd have on this, to reaffirm what you said. When we look at the metrics and the means by which we pursue, and in the course that, some of your second year students have taken with me, we spend a lot of time looking at this of how do you pursue a Christ-like agenda in a non-Christ-like way. The means and the message have to match each other. So means, message, and method have to fit. And oftentimes we find ourselves copying and paste from whatever's trendy at Harvard Law School or business school as the way in which we grow a church. And our track record is actually terrible on producing the kind of lasting change. Now, you can make a big bang and a big flash in the pan, but if you want long-term lasting change, most of that has been done not by people who set out to change the world, but by people who sometime around age 60 looked back and were like, that's hilarious how God used me in the world. And so there's not a phenomenal amount of strategizing that I see. Yes, there are a couple people and a couple things here and there, but you can't take out the divine factor of it wasn't because they had the right youth pastor encouraging them to invest their money correctly. It was because God put other people in their path that it turned out that they look back. And the fun thing about doing it this way is then when something really genuinely good does happen, who gets credit for it? God gets credit for it because good and well you wouldn't have been able to come up with that and do it on your own. And so rather than it being a self-building enterprise, you look back and you praise the Lord for the ways in which he used you disproportionate to the abilities that you actually have. And I think that's a healthier and by far less stressful and more fun way to approach discipleship and cultural change.
So you said healthier and by far more fun way. I think there's a strange irony here it is simpler, and yet I think it's unknown. It's been obscured. I think if you go into a standard church and say, "Hey, do this differently," their almost immediate response is, "How can we figure out a way to raise more money, get more fame, and more fortune?" I mean, there's a more power, and so when you say that, break that down a little bit. If God is indeed saying, being faithful to me, serving and changing the world does not require fame, fortune, and power. That's not to say that God doesn't use that in some places, and that some people are gifted with those things and that ought to use them responsibly. But if the reality is going to be that that's not the case for most of us, what are the things that if now I guess it's not so much what are things we should do, but I think that the kind of comeback to that is incorrect is to say, well, then I don't have to be that good. In other words,
Mhm.
it's an abandonment of excellence. I was in a car going to a conference one time. We were at a hotel, and the conference center was a little bit away, and they sent a shuttle to pick us up. And I was riding with another speaker, and I was making some variation of this, and she had a pretty visceral reaction to that. She said, "No, no, no. Every time we get down that road, people use it as an excuse to not be excellent. That's just a fancy excuse to not try your hardest." And so there's a level here where it's saying, no, 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 this is not about not being excellent, but it's about being excellent at different things. And so, if we would sort of shift that and say, let's maintain a high level of personal excellence, as much as meaning that we use our gifts and our abilities as well as we possibly can, focused how? What is the end goal that you would say to focus on?
Okay, yeah. So before we get to that, let's step back for a second. And as you're listening to this, think about this. What problem exists in your local community or in your worshiping congregation, in your church, where only a famous person could solve that problem? Like, think right now about the real needs that you know. And is money the main hang up there? Is power, like, do you need a better politician attending your church? If Taylor Swift started attending my church, I have no idea what we would do with her. Like, I see zero skill sets that would be useful for what we're doing at advancing kingdom of God in our community. I'm only being a little cheeky here, but I'm not joking. Like, if you look at the
Right.
real problems that you are approximate to by the fact that you're placed in a certain situation, I don't need those people. Now, here's where it gets crazy. When you're talking about being excellent, a good question to ask yourself is what can I do that no one else can? And this is an interesting way of thinking, of saying, so what does your church do in your community that no other organization can do? How are you located to serve somebody and serve a need that nobody else even knows exists? Like, that's when it gets fun. So this is not a like, oh, sit back and don't do anything. Actually, it's to say you need to radically recalibrate what your ability to see need. Like, we talk to our kids about this all the time and pray about this as a family all the time. Lord, would you give us the ability to see needs and meet them? And it has to go in that order, because some of us are not hardwired to see the actual needs that are right in front of us. So there's the divine aid in seeing the actual need. So that's a matter of focus. Set your minds on things above where Christ is seated at the right hand, right? So it's a matter of focus, what's really important. And then there's the preparation side of that, and be able to meet them. And if you're part of a community, meeting a need is going to be everything from fixing flat tires to re-roofing to grief counseling to, I mean, it's wild. The actual tangible needs that are around you, comforting the sick, making food for the lonely. I mean, that is just stuff that you can't import from anywhere else. So if we go back in kind of that Acts 17 idea where Paul's talking about that God ordained the times and places that we would live, that we should reach out to him and find him, though he's not far from every one of us, then all of a sudden that reframes us thinking about where I live, and wherever you are sitting or driving or standing right now as you listen to this is not accidental. It's far better to think of yourself in a Christian as like a Minuteman or like a militia, of like, God changes the world by having people he can tap on the shoulder at a moment's notice and say, hey, go do this. You look at, Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch, go chase a chariot. Well, that's ridiculous. Okay, I'll do it. Like, there's not a strategy there. He's just minding his own business and God says, go chase a chariot, right? That is more normally how. So the difference here is like, let God be the quarterback and you be the wide receiver, and you run your route whether the ball's thrown to you or not, because that's part of the play. I think this is more how that works. We want to be the quarterback, or we want to be in the box seat and look at the whole stadium and say, this is how I'm going to actualize God's plan in the earth. And then we're miserable when our attempts at that don't work. rather than say, okay, Lord, what do you want me to do today? And we also don't want to like poo-poo the idea of doing nothing. Like God told Elijah to go sit by a creek for 3 years. I mean, if that's God's will, apparently nothing was the greatest plan there. Eat some raven food. So our ability to hypothesize and to project what God's will is for our lives without daily praying thy will be done, I haven't seen a lot of good examples of that.
I think it's an excellent, if you're listening to this, I want you to really pay attention to that last phrase that Nathan just pointed out. So Nathan, I don't know if your experience is the same, but when I talk to young people, especially Christian young people, the number one concern is finding God's will for their life. When God's will is defined as an overarching macro plan with a lot of detail that it's at least 20 years long, if not longer. And also this kind of inherent thought that that plan is somehow hidden, perhaps buried deep inside myself somewhere, and that if I'm righteous enough and faithful enough and pray enough, I will discover that mystery, and then I will live a life of bliss and service. And I'm exaggerating that a little bit, but honestly, I've had people give that to me almost in those kind of terms. And I think what you said is a really important piece where God's, in our Navigate class, we have this section, and a spoiler alert if anybody's in Navigate, where I say, I already know what God's purpose is for you. I can give it to you right now. It's to love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your mind, and all your soul, and your neighbor as yourself. Now, how you carry that out may vary wildly, and you have some autonomy to figure out how you carry out to some extent. That's part of being made in the image of God. But it starts immediately in front of you. And there is both a simplicity and hopefully a relief of stress there. I don't have to have this sort of master plan in mind. I just have to start. And there's also an urgency that, I mean, like right now start, like immediately start, like pray right now
Yeah.
and look for the needs in front of you.
Mm-hmm.
And so, there's kind of like, once you know this, great, you can shrug your shoulders and say, oh, good, now I don't have to figure that out. Also, you have to roll up your sleeves and go to work instantly because there's probably work to do immediately. Now, you couched a lot of that in terms of the local church, Nathan, and I want to come to that because I have a deep commitment to the local church, despite, and Nathan maybe more than most people knows this, despite some confusing sometimes situations with local churches, I'm absolutely convinced that that's God's plan A and there isn't a plan B. And in fact, when it comes to Unbound, we frequently, at every live event, tell our students, don't forget, we're not the church. And don't let us accidentally start to act like a church. And yet, I find more and more that students have almost no context for what a local church ought to be or should be, or the importance of that. Now, I know you personally in the sense that no matter what you have done, you have highly prioritized being a member of a local church. And so if you could speak to that a little bit in terms of what that looks like a little bit and the importance of that, especially in relation to what we just talked about in terms of, doing God's work and focusing on things immediately in front of you and seeing the needs that are in front of you.
Yeah. Let me answer that in terms of, well, let's hit it from a couple angles here. Back to what you were saying about this discovering of God's plan for your life. It's almost like we set that up as if when we're 19 years old, we need to know how to write our obituary. And then they worked for 47 years of this and then they died. Okay, interesting. But
there's actually exercises and books that are popular that tell you to do exactly that.
Okay.
I've literally seen books that say that you write your obituary and be able to look back on your life, so.
Yeah, well,
Literally.
So I think that's a wonderful idea. I've never seen it work like that in anybody's life. So take that with a grain of salt. That's just me pontificating. So we tend to set this up in terms of career, of purpose as career. And I would just mention that a lot of the godly people that I know who have good careers, their career is not the foundation of their identity or who they is. It funds their mission and their ministry and the rest of their lives. So it's almost like the solid Christian people see that even pursuing the career or that quote plan is just a way to finance or whatever, the rest of the things that are really interesting they're doing with their lives. So there's that. That our goal is not to have a certain career. So think of your development at this stage in character, in terms of character, not of career. So it doesn't say anywhere in the New Testament.
Can you, say some more about that because I think I'm with you. But I think that's for most people listening, that's going to be a bombshell. Like, wait a second. Because, and I think it goes back to our original point here, that if subtly, invisibly, almost to the point that a fish doesn't know it's wet, that kind of pervasiveness, the understanding is the whole point of growing up and the whole is success. And success is all founded on getting the right career. so that you can have that security and that safety and that fame, fortune, power, all those kinds of things. And that's always the mechanism that comes through. So I think what you said there, I think makes sense, but I think you said something really radical for most people listening when you said career, whatever. I mean, it's minor compared to something. Focus more on the development of your character than development of your career is what you said. Build that out a little bit before you get to that next point, because I think that's a big one that I don't want to miss.
Yeah. So here's the other thing is that the point of your career is not just to provide finances for whatever you do. Think Romans 8 here with me for a second, that God's goal for your life is to be conformed to the image of the Son. Okay, so pretty high standard, which means that God will place you in the career that helps you grow to be most Christ-like. So when you're making a decision about where should I live, who do I marry, what kind of job do I have, that's not an incidental, detached, separate category from your growth and discipleship. You will be formed by how you answer those questions. So if we see that as part of the formation of what it is that God wants to be doing in us, then that helps us ask some different questions about what we're doing there as well. Now, the way that this ties back in to say, let's focus on character, not on career, and then we allow God to open the doors. I pray that all the time. Like, Lord, make this door, like open the open doors wide for me and close the bad doors because I'm terrible at discerning sometimes, right? So one of my grandfathers used to tell me, Nathan, get yourself ready and then let the Lord use you. It goes in that. Ready for what? I don't know. Be faithful at the things. Whenever I'm trying to decide what to do next in life and I don't know, then it's always a time for me to loop back around and make sure I'm doing an excellent job of the things I do know I'm supposed to be doing and recognize that God has me in that place and is growing and shaping something in me to prepare me for the next thing that he has for me. So I can sit around on my hands bemoaning all that I don't have or, the plans that aren't coming together, and that's doing nothing. It's more helpful to say, what is God teaching me in this time? How do you grow on the plateau? Is one of the ways that I've put it. Like, okay, I feel like I've plateaued in life, but God is good and can change things. So the fact that I'm here means that I need to learn from here. Now, to loop all of that back around into the church is I'm not smart enough to figure out any of this on my own most of the time. And I need somebody to flick me in the back of the head and say, hey, I tried that when I was your age. Don't do that. Or, hey, you should consider doing this. And the fact of the matter is we all have wishes and desires, and then we have gifts that God has given us. But oftentimes you're not the best one at figuring out what those are. And you need people who love you around you to give you a little guidance and the gumption and to push you out of the nest at the right time or to pull you back in at the right moments in order for you to grow correctly. And so for me, the church, outside of a place of worshiping the Lord in spirit and truth, and outside of it being a place where we shape and form each other to get better at ministry, it's a community that's kind of a safety net. It's like a little kid bowling. You ever go to a bowling alley and they pop up those little bumpers in the bowling, like so you can't get a gutter ball? Like older wise Christians are like your bumper so you can't get a gutter ball in bowling. That's what the church is like for me. And like, okay, and sometimes you get a strike because you like bounce it off the bumpers enough times that it hits something. That's what the church does for me socially and as a theological, spiritual, mentoring, and forming decision is it helps me keep my bowling ball rolling in the right direction while I'm trying to figure things out in life. And that's a phenomenal blessing.
I think that's a great illustration. I think that when people hear that, they say that's great. And then there's always this kind of, but how do I find a church, or how do I participate in a church in a way that gives me that? And I think you've got an interesting perspective on this because you're part of a church that you've been part of since you were born. And yet you spent a period of your life living away from your community, from the community you grew up in, and actually relocating quite frequently, and yet still managed to be part of churches throughout all of that. So maybe just share with us a little bit. How is it that you, as you moved around to different places, how did you kind of find a way to connect to the right church, and what process did you use there?
Yeah. So, this is getting trickier, but yeah, sometimes we move to a city and I would just make a bunch of phone calls because I didn't have time to visit. I mean, it takes a long time to visit churches because you can only do like 2 or 3
Right.
a Sunday tops if you plan it out well. So sometimes it's just a good phone call, like, what do you believe about this? What do you believe about this? What do you believe about this? Thanks. Bye. You can knock some off pretty fast. And then I think the other one is we're always looking for churches that aren't trying to be relevant. That's a weird goal for a church. And the funny thing is that churches are trying to be relevant are always like 3 years behind culture. And so it just makes it extra awkward. So, it's not wrong to do important things well. it's wrong to make idols out of your coffee and your music and, some of your other things. And so we were looking for congregations where the preaching and the teaching was solid, that people deferred to Scripture as the primary authority on how decisions were being made. And then we also evaluated is the room here for us to, how do we contribute to this? And the contribution thing is important here, is because you never feel like you're part of a community if you're only receiving from that group. You can't get enough from a community to make you feel like you're part of a community. You only feel like you're part of a community when you yourself are contributing to that community. And that's a tricky one. And so when you're looking for a church, you're looking for a group of people that you can identify with and say we with pride, in the sense of like, this is what we're doing. So is there a mission that group has beyond their own existence that I can participate in and that I can contribute to? Now, then that's not like, oh, you should only go to a church where you can be preaching and teaching or on the leadership team or anything like that. That's not true. There were moments in my life when I was working and traveling and speaking and studying and I was exhausted, and I was part of a church where I said to the church leadership, it would be wonderful if I could come in here and not lead anything and just sit on the pew as average person and worship with you guys. And they said, we'd love that. And then I did move into a position where I worked in the nursery every other month. I needed that, working, kind of in a high-end intellectual academic pursuit of Christian theology and faith. It was good for me to go feed goldfish crackers to the 2-year-olds and wipe snotty noses as my contribution to that community, right? So it goes back, the very first calling that I had in the church was doorstop. He said, hey, kid, stand here and hold this door open, right? And that's how you get into this, is you let somebody else call out the gift that you have, and then you do an excellent job at the thing you were asked to do. And then it progressed like, hey, at 11:30, can you ring this buzzer to let everybody know Sunday school's over? And then it moves on from there. So I think a couple things. First of all, the easy stuff. Knock out, goofy theology. You don't have time for that. Who are the people who are there people there who are legitimately pursuing Christ and Christ likeness, and aren't there just about themselves? How do I participate and serve in this? And is there an identity formed around this that I see a way that I can be part of it? And if you have those things, Os Guinness once said a helpful line. I was there, but I'm sure he's written this somewhere else too. He said that people love the idea of community until they find out there are other people in it. And so if you start off with the idea that community as an ideal never actually exists that way, then it becomes pretty important that you join a group of people who are using Christ as the model to reconcile your differences, to offer forgiveness, to have grace and mercy when people get it wrong and mess up. So we're not talking about seeking perfection here. We're not setting a high standard for what it means to be a church. We're setting a standard of people who are actually pursuing, worshiping the Lord, and allowing themselves to be changed by what God is doing in their lives, and willingness to share that with other people. So on one hand, it sounds super complicated. On the other hand, there are a lot of great churches out there. Don't give up hope.
I think there's lots of important things you said there. The whole idea that you can't participate in a community until you have a chance to get back. That has certainly been true in my life. And in fact, the congregation that we're part of now, we attended in a leadership role initially. I came as a youth young adult pastor, and still just didn't really feel part of the community until there was a point where the young adult group at the time went and worked for an entire afternoon clearing brush out of a couple of congregation members' yards and stuff like that. And it was like that was the transformative, like I can point to that day as the day that we truly became members of that church.
Mm-hmm.
That it was the serving together outside the walls of the building that all of a sudden made us feel like we were at home. And the second big piece of that, and something to think about, is when we were invited to somebody's house for dinner.
Mm-hmm.
And so now when people come to our church, I think they're really not a member of our church. And I mean, and I don't mean this in like a technical way. I mean, I don't think that they'll really feel like they're part of it until we get them intrigued enough to come serve alongside us and do something, and that we've had them to dinner somewhere or they've eaten a meal with us. And that, I think there's a interesting sort of standard there that if you break bread together and you do work together, you'll likely be pretty far down the road becoming a community. And if you can do that in the context of people that have solid theology, you're probably well on the way to finding a good church. My other backup method is to not attend the service, to just drive there, start to stopwatch as soon as the sermon's ended, and see how long it takes for the last car to leave. And my sort of kind of bottom line is probably the church that takes the longest to empty the parking lot is a pretty good place to start. So anyhow, that's my
that's a good one.
opinion. Well, Nathan, as we wrap this up, when we're recording this, it's kind of what I consider to be sort of the normal news cycle at the moment. Bad things are happening, some of them more catastrophically bad than others. At this recording, we're not too far along from the Hamas invasion of Israel and all the stuff that comes with that. And this is a whole different topic. And so, and we'll have you back to discuss this later. But in addition to the other things I know you as somebody who has unfailing, unflagging, and infectious hope. And I've just never had a conversation with you about anything that I left feeling worse about things. I've always left feeling better, even though we may not have come up with solutions or fixed things or something like that. There's just always this. You have an instinctive ability to bring us back to the bigger picture that is one of hope. And so maybe I'll just give you a chance for a last word here to sort of end this with that. We didn't talk necessarily about depressing things here, but to kind of contextualize this conversation about churches and service and figuring out what you're supposed to do in the world and the difference between success, rich, famous, and powerful, and actually doing things for the kingdom of God, those kinds of things. But give us a last word there and point us in that direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a couple parts of that. And this is also the value of going to a church that really does a good job of emphasizing like the multi-generational span. You need some older Christians in your life who can remember and help you properly contextualize how big of a deal something actually is. That's really helpful to talk to somebody who like remembers World War II, or it helps you see that like what we spaz out about now is bad, but it fits into a broader. Oftentimes, depression comes from overly narrowly focusing on something, and we have to say, yes, this is bad, but you're not running that thought alongside what is also beautiful. I was just speaking at a memorial service for a little girl who died recently last night, and I talk about living in the beauty and the brokenness. And there's a sense there in which we have to be able to see both of those well in order to have a realistic grasp on what's happening in the world. So there's the brokenness and the beauty, and we have to remember both of those, but we also have to remember the promises that God has embedded in both of those. And one of the unique things about Christian hope is that it isn't simply wish fulfillment. Like, oftentimes we use hope in entirely future tense terms, like, I hope it doesn't rain tomorrow, I hope to get married, I hope the stock market does better. It's all like, I hope this will happen, but I don't have anything in the past that helps me see that hope will happen. Christian hope is different if you look at the fact that Christian hope is based on something that has already happened. So Christian hope has a rearview mirror to it. If you look at, for example, in 1 Peter, this idea of hope and a living hope, Peter's always writing about hope in the context of what God has done in the world through the work of Jesus Christ. And so, like, our hope for the resurrection, our hope for forgiveness, our hope for reconciliation are all things that have already been achieved. And our hope means that we're just waiting for the story to unfold to see what the rest of it means. And so the fact that the foundation for our hope is something that has already happened, not a conjecture, radically changes the way in which we think about not only what we're living through now, but how we see the future. And so there's a real beauty there where you can read to the end of the book that it describes the logical outworking of what's happened in the past. And so even there's just so much in Christian theology and worship where we kind of reflect back on who God is and what he has done. We bring our problems, our prayers and petitions, and our confession of our own sin and brokenness for now, and we look forward to the Lord's return in the future in which all things will be made new. And so when I talk about hope, hope is real, and it has some real, and that's a whole nother conversation of like what the tangible benefits are of legitimate hope. But I think we're looking at a world in which I would say stability and legitimate hope are some of the rarest and most sought after commodities, and the Christian church has those in spades. This is our game. Like, welcome. Let's go for it. We've got the best message, the best news, the best methods, and the best people working on it. And it all comes together by us daily being obedient to being our part of the play that God is planning. And we praise him in hindsight for the way in which he pieces it all together. And we look back and see the puzzle at the end of all our little odd shapes and turns being masterfully woven together. So my family's only been Christian for a couple hundred years. That's how it's worked out for us. And I think, in my own life, in my own church, in my own family, and in the nature of history, that this is what God's up to in the world. And so I commend to those of you who are dreamers, dream big, but don't neglect the present. Hold your hands open before the Lord each day and say, what do you have for me to do today? What do you want me to see today? Who can I encourage today? Who will encourage me? Who can I teach? Who will teach me? And be mindful of looking at today and not missing out on today because you're distracted by your plans that probably won't happen 3 years from now.
As we end, maybe just point to this principle, this idea that the truth is, it is not a hope, I hope this will happen. It is a hope that is based on something that has already taken place, as Nathan just said there. And that then the perspective would be, if that is the case, if that is the truth, then you were in a process of discovery that may have some twists and turns and some hard parts, but yet it is one that we already know the ending of. And I think that's a very
Yeah.
different perspective, but it's also a very old perspective. So I say it's different because it sounds maybe strange to modern ears, and yet it is the perspective that the gospel has proclaimed and the church has taught, and the reality that has been available to all those who follow Christ through all these many centuries. And so you're holding on to a new truth, even if it seems and feels new to you. So, Nathan, thank you so much for joining us. I would just end this by saying, if you enjoyed this, and I imagine that you have, make sure that you search for Thinking Out Loud podcast with Nathan Rittenhouse and Cameron McAllister. I've listened literally to every single episode they've ever produced. I have benefited from all of them. In fact, just a few minutes before we started this one, I was listening to Nathan and Cameron talk about their latest podcast as I was eating lunch. And so definitely, if you enjoy Be Unbound, I know you'll enjoy that podcast as well. So make sure you go over there and subscribe. You'll not want to miss an episode of that. Nathan, thank you for joining us. Thanks for sharing your perspective. And I'll look forward to doing this again in the near future.
It's a pleasure. It's wonderful when the Lord can use our quirks, and we'll see what he does with us next.
All right. Well, we hope you enjoyed that conversation with Nathan. Like we said at the beginning, there was probably 10 more things we could have talked about, and we'll definitely make a point of having Nathan back. And do check out his podcast that he does if you're interested in the kind of content he talks about. As we finish up here, just a reminder in terms of, how these things relate to Unbound. There's so much that Nathan said that I was like, yes, that's exactly what we say. That's not accidental. I think some of that comes from the fact that we've learned it from Nathan. And there's an integration of a lot of ideas that Nathan talked about into the very fabric of Unbound and the programs we offer. And so in addition to this podcast, if you just found us through the podcast, the heart of Unbound and what we do is we are a training company that prepares, equips young people to thrive. And we do that through several different programs. And if you're interested in any of those programs, you'll find significant echoes, if not downright pattern repeats here to the kinds of things we talked about in this podcast. In terms of just chronology, we start with a high school program that's called Equip, and that is for typically homeschooled high school students that will work with any curriculum. And we have a sister program called Declare that works specifically with the My Father's World high school curriculum. So if you're new to homeschooling and you're looking for a curriculum, well, we would recommend Declare and the great folks at My Father's World, and our coaches will actually walk you through that curriculum. If you're interested in kind of making sure that your student learns the things that they actually need to know. Now, in this conversation with Nathan, we talked several times about the fact that success, as put forward by the traditional education community, is not what we're aiming for here. And Nathan even went so far as to say, don't focus on your career. Look to build your character, not your career. And that, experienced Christian people would say that the career was not the point, that there was something deeper and more transcendent than a career. And I mentioned in our conversation, that's kind of a radical idea. Well, I'd like to just let you know that that's a radical idea that we take very seriously. And so our high school programs are really built on this premise that the academics that you learn are good in and of themselves, but the process of learning them should teach you something bigger that you'll use for the rest of your life, not just for career. Transferable skills in terms of analytical thinking and problem solving and communications and the ability to learn new things and ask good questions and all that kind of stuff. And so our Equip programs and our Declare programs are really based on that thesis. And then it culminates with a senior program that we call Explore that offers all those ideas, but really set up in such a way to launch people into the rest of their lives. And we hope the next step of their life is our Ascend program, which is designed for 18-plus-year-old students. And so what we'd consider typically to be traditionally college-age students. And Ascend is a pretty selective, pretty serious, pretty elite program designed to teach young people how to thrive. And we do that through a series of interconnected live events. We do that through skill-based education and project-based learning. And if you're interested in those kinds of things, go to beunbound.us and you'll find more information there. And we'd be delighted to talk to you about what we do and have you join us for some of these ideas that you heard so eloquently talked about on this program. So thanks for joining us. And until next time, we would challenge you to be unbound.